In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
This week on my drive to work, I happened to hear an interview with Ken Burns, the producer of so many of those wonderful PBS historical series, and he's got a new one out. I believe it starts tonight on the Vietnam War. Many of you have had intimate relationships with that war. Some of you know Dan Lay. His stories of growing up in Saigon in the early 1970s have been amazing. He had just a regular childhood like any other kid. His family owned a movie theater along with some other things, and they would go to the movies. The family would go to the beach for vacation. He would walk home after school, maybe stop at the library or stop by his dad's office and walk home with his dad. But then at night, sometimes they'd be awoken by loud explosions and find out in the next morning that some family they knew several blocks over had their home destroyed. It was quite an amazing childhood. He and his siblings escaped Vietnam just before the fall of Saigon, leaving their parents behind, who figured this will be over soon. We better keep an eye on our businesses. Well, that didn't happen to work out. It's a famous news photo from the Vietnam War that you all know. I know you've seen it a million times. The photo of the naked girl running down the road, her clothes burned off and her body burned by napalm. A day one preacher by the name of Bob Zanicki told this story. The man who coordinated that raid on this child's village in June of '71 was 24-year-old Army helicopter pilot John Plummer. The day after the raid was conducted, Plummer saw that photo of that young girl in the Stars and Stripes newspaper, and he was devastated because he was the one that dropped bombs. He said, "It just knocked me to my knees, and that was when I knew I could never talk about this." So he was tormented by this guilt. He had nightmares of this child. He heard children screaming. Well, the girl in that photo, named Pham Thi Kim Phuc, survived 17 operations on her burned body and eventually relocated to Toronto and became a Goodwill ambassador for UNESCO. And in 1996, Plummer heard that Kim would be speaking at a Veterans Day observance right in his city. So he went and heard her story. And during her talk, she said, "If I could talk face to face with the pilot who dropped the bombs, I would tell him we could not change history, but we should try to do good things for the present." Well, Plummer in the audience wrote her a note that said, "I am that man." And after her speech, he pushed through the crowd to greet her. And he says, "She just opened her arms to me. I fell right into her arms sobbing. All I could say is, 'I'm so sorry. I'm just so sorry.'" And Kim responded, "It's all right. I forgive. I forgive." The need to be forgiven and to forgive is so profound. We know it deep inside. We feel it. We need that freedom of being forgiven and of forgiven. Forgiveness is vital for any society to exist and flourish. It's vital for relationships to continue and mature, and it's vital for one's personal existence and health. It's interesting, in recent years there have been some scientific studies on the impact of forgiveness in people's lives, and research shows that holding on to the anger or the pain or the hurt increases your chances of a heart attack, as well as cancer, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and other illnesses. Forgiveness actually lowers your blood pressure and your heart rate. Forgiveness also helps you sleep better at night and boosts a positive change in your attitude. And one psychiatrist, Richard Fitzgibbon, said, forgiveness is an intellectual decision you make to give up your anger and your feelings of revenge. It doesn't happen just naturally. You have to make a decision of your will. And he says also that forgiving does not necessarily mean forgetting. It is letting go of the anger and the hurt and moving on. And it doesn't preclude justice being done for the hurt. Well, Jesus, as you know, was greatly concerned about forgiveness. Last week we had the gospel text about forgiving your brother or sister who has hurt you in the church. Remember, there was kind of a legal process that you went through. You first went alone to the person and try to work it out. If that didn't work, you took 2 witnesses to try to work it out. If that didn't work, the person came before the church, and hopefully that made it work. And it was a whole process, but the goal of that was forgiveness and restoration and reconciliation. Well, this time, right after that, we heard, Peter blurts out that big question: how many times do I have to forgive someone who hurts me in the church? Now, Peter would know that contemporary thought and kind of orthodox religion at the time would be that a person should forgive his brother 3 times. That seems like a lot, not just once, but 3 times. And Peter really wanted to know, really, Jesus, how many times should I be willing to forgive someone who has sinned against me? Give me a formula, an equation that will allow me to fulfill my obligation to that other person and keep me in good standing with God. Is it 3 or maybe even 7? And Jesus said to him, I do not say to you 7 times, but 70 times 7. Now, those of you math wizards have already figured out that that's 490 times. Now, how in the world are we supposed to keep up with that? Are we supposed to keep a little notebook and check off, okay, that's 383. But that's not Jesus' point. Of course, what he's saying by the use of the number 7, which is the number of perfection in Bible times, was you should forgive 70 times 7 times 70 times 7 times infinity. That's the point. No limits to the number of times you forgive. For God has no limits on forgiveness of us. You mean, Jesus, I must forgive even when I don't feel like it, even when I'm hurt and angry? Jesus says yes. Now, an interesting factor in forgiveness is that it not only does something for the one forgiven, but it does something also for the person who is doing forgiving. It's free. So why don't more people forgive those who have hurt them? Well, Jesus followed this answer with this story of the man who owed the king, his lord, 10,000 talents. That was equal to 15 years of wages for a laborer in that time. The man pleaded for the king to have patience. He would repay everything. I don't know how he would do that, but the king had pity on this man, and he forgave him his total debt. And then this forgiven man goes right out and runs into another servant that owed him 100 denarii, which is the amount of 1 day's work, as opposed to 15 years' work. And what do you suppose this recently forgiven man did about this? He grabbed this guy by the throat and said, "You pay up." What? Well, this owing servant pleaded with the forgiving man, just like he had done with the Lord, "Have patience on me, and I will repay you." But the forgiven man refused to be moved and had the other servant thrown into debtor's prison. It's hard to believe Here was a person who had been forgiven 15 years worth of work, and he was not willing to forgive a debt owed by a man in the amount of one day's work. Then you think about it, and I can think about it, and I've done something maybe not that outrageously different, but close enough. The issue here is we have been forgiven by Almighty God. But can it be that we are not willing to forgive a fellow human being? The debt we owe to God was uncountable. And yet, we've received that forgiveness totally and completely and forever. And now when we're out in everyday life and the grit and grime of our existence in the trenches, is it possible that we won't forgive someone who has wronged us? I know that's happened to me. Forgiveness is not passive resignation to a bad situation. Rather, forgiveness is to be a positive, joyful, active effort in which we change from seeing ourselves as victims to being victors. Forgiveness enables us to move from weakness to strength, from inadequacy to self-affirmation. And the presence of the divine in our lives is perceived in forgiving others. It takes two to reconcile, and reconciliation is important, but it only takes one to forgive. And we're not excusing necessarily the action, whatever caused the pain, the hurt, the anger. We're not ignoring the wrong, the sin committed, and the person responsible. We're not eclipsing justice if that's required. What we're doing is setting ourselves free from the weight of harm that we have carried far too long. Forgive. Let it go. Release it. Throw it out. For some, the time is right, and you can go to someone who has hurt you or who you know you have hurt and try to reconcile. There may be people in your life who are no longer with us, and you have to deal with that. So for some of us, it may take some time and some healing to actually work this out. Forgiveness and being forgiven is part of the fabric of being human. It's helpful, yes, but that's not the reason we do it. We do it to be obedient to God. Forgiveness is freeing, but that's not the reason we do it, to feel better, to feel free. But it does free us to be more of the person that God intends us to be when we have dropped that burden. And make no mistake, God's forgiveness is not fair, it is grace. God's forgiveness is not a tit for tat, a penny taken and a penny placed on the scale. It's not a zero-sum game. God's grace is freedom to live large, not to be hung up on others' shortcomings, but to rejoice in God's extravagant acceptance and then share that extravagance with others. Many years ago, I deeply, deeply hurt somebody very important to me. And it was so important for me to get forgiveness from that person. And it took a long time before they would be willing to offer that forgiveness. But one day they did that. And then some months passed, and this person said, you know, I'd like to talk with you again. I thought, oh, here we go again. I'm going to have to ask for forgiveness again. But no, this time they said, I want you to forgive me for the part that I had in what happened. It was very powerful and profound. Thank God, God does not weigh what is fair and what is not. Thank God, God forgives beyond measure. And thank God we have the freedom to do likewise. Amen.
Amen.